tell me your name, when and where you were born, if you don't mind, and where you grew up.
My name is Katherine Sprague. I was born in Pullman, Washington in 1965. My family made the long jaunt to move to Moscow when I was 4 years old, and I've pretty much lived here in Moscow since then, so some 50 years almost.
What was it like growing up in Idaho?
You know, I had a really bizarre childhood, in all honesty. My dad was an anthropologist. He worked very closely with a lot of the local tribes. Our next door neighbor was the pea and lentil commissioner. And I thought that every suburban neighborhood had Nez Perce Indians come over and drum and dance on the lawn, and lentil buyers from Japan come over and drink all of the scotch in the neighborhood. It was kind of the Mad Men era, so they all drank heavily, but nobody was an out-of-control alcoholic. It was a very strange time, and I lived in my little bubble. One of the first black professors, African-American man, was hired by my dad at the U of I. There were some things that came up, and my dad was ordered to fire him. And because it was a personnel issue, my dad couldn't say anything in the news. But it's very interesting because as a child, I went from being a nigger lover to a racist sack of shit in a matter of weeks. So I've always been cognizant of two sides to every story, and I'm also very aware of discrimination. And some of the reasons my dad didn't want to talk had to do with a lot of racist stereotypes. He didn't want to go there. And you know, I didn't realize that the Repatriation Act with Native artifacts, I thought that was law in the 70s or 80s. I didn't realize that it was a long fight, and I also didn't realize that his testimony was part of the Supreme Court case when that law was enacted. So, you know, I've had an interesting perspective for a very privileged white girl.
Would you describe where you live as urban or rural? Because Moscow's a weird...
You know, we are surrounded by wheat fields. I'm 2 blocks from one of the oldest high schools in the state, and it was a monument that the wheat farmers in this area built for their youth, for the education. So we're rural, but we're a college town. So we're in that weird twilight zone. But it's rural.
When did you come out? What was coming out like?
Oh my God, I was one of those brilliant people that during Reagan's first administration, I came out of the closet. Not a good time. Not a really great time. I ended up dropping out of Moscow High School. I would have graduated in 1983. Things were better. Harvey Milk had already been assassinated. You know, things were better, but there was that setback with Reagan. I think the highlight of my childhood was the cool skiing Pope, and Jimmy Carter was our president, and it seemed like everything was just going to keep getting better. And of course it didn't get better, and now here we are.
Did you have fear as a youth?
I didn't think that my family would reject me completely. I didn't have that kind of fear. I was harassed at the high school. You know, I've been beaten up. I've had friends murdered. At least 2 gay men that I know have died violent deaths. I think my fear set in as I got older, when I was in college, and even after college. You know, the male co-chair of the U of I student group, I think it was GSA at the time, he was bashed twice. You know, a good friend of mine. You know, Tabitha and I ran for city council once. Tabitha and I ended up getting an unlisted phone number. I didn't realize at the time I ran that I was the first out lesbian in the state of Idaho to run for public office. There was a lesbian before who'd run in a rural community here and won. Nicole Lefevre ran for a state seat many years later as an out lesbian, but I was in that space where I was out. I ended up dropping out of the race because it just got so obnoxious. You know, it's the daily harassment that gets to you.
Like what specifically? Can you give an example?
You know,
Yeah.
you know, people throw around microaggression, and if you understand it, it's a great term. It's very descriptive. If you don't understand what it means, it's just PC talk and people should stop whining. But if take every single slight, every single rude comment as a grain of sand, and most of them you just brush off. After a while, you know, you can't brush off all of them. And at some point, you know, the high school kid standing outside of your shop door screaming anti-gay slurs, that's enough, and you snap, and you can't brush that off, and it grates, it abrades your skin, it gets into your psyche. So, you know, it's the little shit. It's really the little shit that just wears you down.
Did you have a support system as a kid? Was your, like you said, your family was supportive?
Yeah. You know, when I was in high school, there was a group of us that kind of came out together. And I've always managed to have a support system, even if I ended up moving into a used bookstore and living there. I've always had the friends. I've always managed to have a support system, and that has saved my life. And you know, as a result of that, Tabitha and I have gone out of our way to be a support system. And honestly, in the current political climate, I would just as soon shutter the doors and go live off of the grid. But as my wife has pointed out, we create a safe space. And we are just a couple of blocks from the high school. And there are the kids who come down here, not to scream slurs outside of our door, but to come through our doors and have that safe space, even if it's just their lunch hour.
What models or messages did you have about LGBTQ people, and what sense did you make of those as a kid? Or did you have them?
You know, it's to me it's very entertaining because as a child, I was born on Groundhog Day. I'm a groundhog, and the only other person I knew growing up who was also a groundhog was one of my dad's students out on one of the archaeological digs, and Mary was a groundhog too, and Mary was a lesbian. And so somehow that tiny tentative connection was a big deal for me. You know, and just knowing people, my mom got her degree in opera performance, so she knew a lot of rather flamboyant men, and one of her professors was in a long-term relationship with another professor in a different department. You know, just knowing that gay people existed and were okay, that went a long way. But I think growing up in a college town rather than a really rural school district, or like a lot of the kids in southern Idaho, where the majority of the population it's a monoculture. Everybody's the same religion, everybody has to behave in an identical fashion. That would have been just crushing for me.
What sorts of clubs or organizations or services were in your area when you were growing up, and did you participate in them, or what was the experience like, or what did it exist then?
Years ago, well, 1976, the documentary Sweet Land of Liberty, there wasn't a queer organization on the Palouse, the Northwest Gay People's Alliance. A lot of those people still live here. But the fact that that documentary aired, and I saw those people, and I saw my mom get angry, they had to have a response. They had to be balanced, and they gave Doug Wilson extra time after the initial airing. And I remember my mom grabbing the phone and calling up and saying, "That man is not a Christian. How can you condemn people? That's not Christianity." And watching my mom freak out and having them read a watered down version of my mom's tirade to Doug Wilson's face.
That's so cool. Who or what were supportive people, places, spaces when you were a kid?
Certainly one more time, there was a retail store downtown that was a little bit funky, very counterculture. There were dances at the community center, and I remember in high school, my friend Jerry showed up to pick me up. We went to our first gay dance together. He showed up, and ironically enough, here we are going to our first gay event, and we have matching outfits on.
What was the outfit?
We had white shirts and a burgundy colored sweater vest and khakis and matching trench coats. I mean, down to the coats. It just was, it was classic. And after those events stopped, Tabitha and I, there have been a lot of organizations started that have bloomed and then died back. For the last 22 years, Tabitha and I have done a monthly drag show here on the Palouse. And it's pretty gratifying when people years later say, "That kept me alive during college." And so I think the most continuity in the queer community have been our drag shows.
So tell me about Tabby Cat and its inception and the details about it.
I had a friend from high school. He moved back to the area because he had full-blown AIDS. At the time, the drugs, there was one. That was AZT. And he was on too high of a dose, so he was breaking out. He had the neuropathy from it. He was scratching. He was absolutely miserable. I helped with hospice care. I was with him when he died. His funeral was my 28th birthday. For my 30th birthday, I decided I'm going to have a big party. I'm going to be happy. We're going to have fun. That was the first show, the very first drag show we did. And this Saturday will be our 22nd anniversary. It'll be my 52nd birthday. And I convinced some of my friends to put on dresses and do drag, and we just went. And the people who were the most afraid of the drag shows were actually the cisgendered gay men. At the time, we just called them the passing guys, They were afraid that drag queens it would be a negative stereotype. We're not all sissies, we don't all wear dresses. No, but goddammit, the sissies are more fun than you.
Cool. Who or what were difficult or dangerous people, places, or spaces when you were a kid?
Dangerous place was Future Farmers of America. I was an FFA. That was not the most welcoming group. They're just certain businesses, people with a certain mindset. I'm a local girl, and I could walk into just about any bar and there would be someone there who knew me, and so I kind of had the advantage of white girls get protected. There's always at least one guy who will stand up. There were dangerous spaces, but I was allowed to glide through them. I remember one night I was very drunk at the Garden Lounge, and a guy that I had been in junior choir with at the Presbyterian Church was sitting there, we're drinking, his family adopted one of our puppies, and I was getting ready to leave, and he said, "I'm gonna walk you home." I'm like, "Oh, whatever, let's go." And it wasn't until several years later that I realized that something was going on that made Craig walk me home. And I am eternally grateful to him for probably keeping me from being raped.
Wow. Okay, current thinking, interpretation in a Trump world. What do you think are the most important resources and strategies that help you live your life today as an LGBTQ person?
The most important thing we have right now is community. The most important thing we have right now is each other. No matter what laws are passed, they're not going to change minds. And more people support gay marriage now than have in the past. More people know someone who's out. We can't allow history to go backwards. As much as Mike Pence would like that, fuck Mike Pence. We're not going away. He is the one that will be extinct in a few years. That mindset, that hateful, hateful mindset. All we can do is keep moving forward and keep supporting each other.
I think you kind of already mentioned that. Because it's like, what about when you were younger as a teenager? Yeah. So, thinking back on all these experiences, how has being lesbian affected your life? Good, bad? What's it given to or added to your life?
You know, I have a very close friend that we've known each other since we were 4 years old. We even have the same first name, although hers is spelled with a C, so, you know, that's different. But I was talking about going into a classroom and talking to the students about my life because I was a lesbian, and so, you know, you always have the show and tell with the queer folk. That's important in social and anthro classes. And Kathy looks at me and she says, so we grew up together and we pretty much have the same lives, but just because you're gay, you get to talk to people. And I'm like, yeah, pretty much. It has certainly made me more aware of other people's struggles. You know, I get so frustrated with the people that, oh, Black Lives Matter is you know, they're overreacting. It's like, no, you have not lived that life. I barely understand that level of oppression, but I understand it happens because it's happened to me. You know, I'm lucky because I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I look like another farm wife. Short hair and all, I blend in. I fly to Texas and everybody uses male pronouns. You know, it's a regional thing, but God, you know, I'm so lucky with all of the experiences I've had. My understanding of human nature, my appreciation for true friendship, you know, it has certainly made my life richer and vastly more entertaining.
Okay. Have other aspects of your identity affected your experience? So, race, class, ethnicity, weight or body size, age, religion, disability, like...
You know, I'm a white girl. The issues that really have affected me the most have not been around my orientation. They have been around my gender. I am a woman. I can still get pregnant even if I choose not to be around a penis. You know, honestly, women's health issues are the #1 concern for me, even over and above maintaining the status of my marriage. Tabitha and I will always love each other. We can always try to fight and be by each other's sides without that legal protection. But the integrity of my body as a woman is always in question in this culture.
Yeah, that's the other question is, it's feminist issues, so you chose not to have children, correct?
You know, when Tabitha and I got together, we had talked about maybe having children, but honestly, in the early 90s, we weren't sure how that would be received. You know, probably 10 years after we got together, it was completely supported by most of our friends. But even in the early days of our relationship, there were people like, oh, I don't know if you guys should have kids. They're gonna get teased at school. And there's also the fact that our healthcare system is so fucked up. If we had had children, it would have been Tabitha while she had a job with insurance. I've never had insurance, you know. Thanks, Obama. I finally finally had health insurance. But, you know, being self-employed, being a lesbian, living on the margins of our society in so many ways, it's been enlightening, especially given the extent of the privilege of my childhood.
Yeah, yeah. If you had lived somewhere else growing up, kind of predicting, setting, in the southern United States, you know, could you speak to how your experience would be different in that respect? Or experiences that you've had in other places?
You know, oh my God, I couldn't imagine growing up or living anywhere else. The Deep South would have been terrifying. I probably would have gotten married and been miserable for about 20 years, had kids, and then gotten divorced when I finally came out. You know, even southern Idaho, my whole story would have been very different. Living in this little liberal bubble, and kind of the libertarian bent of this part of the country. It's nobody's business. People stay out of each other's business. You know, so I can't even imagine. You know, in Texas, everybody would have thought I was a guy. I hate flying through Texas.
Agreed. What would you say to someone like you who's a young person today? What advice would you have for them today?
I try to tell the younger kids that don't take what we have now for granted. It was hard won, and people are still trying to take it back. Also, you know, always be aware of your surroundings. Be careful. You know, Tabitha and I wouldn't even hold hands or kiss in the bar. And, you know, now the same-sex couples, now the kids can hold hands, and those crazy kids can kiss each other in the bar. But we were terrified too, and I always sat with my back to the wall, and I looked at who was in that bar and who was getting outraged by the flamboyant gay man I was with. We had a drag show at the beach one night where a drag queen was arguing with a guy at the bar. The drag queen took off, head to the bathroom, and it wasn't the man she was arguing with, it was his quiet friend that I noticed get up and follow. And so I got up and followed, because it might not be the loudest person in the room, it's the person who's watching you and scoping you out that's going to attack you. It's something that you learn, and it's not as essential now, but you have to always be aware of it, and trying to instill that in a younger generation. And oh my God, tell them don't pretend you're a straight couple. Do not make your marriage or your relationship a mirror of heteronormative behavior. We're queer, enjoy it. That's the biggest thing I try to tell them. Don't be June Cleaver, for God's sakes. Be yourself. Just because we can get married doesn't mean we have to necessarily, and doesn't mean that marriage has to be identical to the dysfunctional one that your parents who probably got divorced had. Build your own relationship.
Cool.
Build your own fucking shit.
So tell me about what you do for a living now, what you've done in the past.
28 years ago, I opened a comic book store because I was tired of restaurant management. We still have the comic book store. Now it's a comic game costume, and we have the adult novelties in the back also in a separate room. So I've been an independent retailer for 28, it'll be 29 years in August. It has given me flexibility. It allows me to be myself. I don't have to follow anyone else's dress code or what they consider acceptable behavior. Sometimes my employees look at me like I'm far more conservative than I should be. There's no facial piercings. We finally had to ease up on that. So I've just enjoyed having this space and being able to be myself and be out. And, you know, like Tabitha keeps reminding me, we have carved a niche where the outsiders, the nerds, the geeks, the queers, the just simply awkward folk have a space where they can come and they're not judged.
Yeah, because you tell us about like events that you put on.
No. Geez, we have our game room where we do all sorts of events here in the store. We do a Thanksgiving dinner. We cook the whole meal with all the fixings and invite our customers and our friends who don't want to go home, can't go home, have a split shift because they work retail. We invite everybody in for an hour or the entire day. We have, we do a New Year's Eve party that's similar, where everybody just plays board games and Warhammer 40K, and we do the monthly drag show at an outside location. Right now we're at the 1912 Center because Jenny is such a delight. But we did drag shows at the Moose Lodge for a number of years. And the fact that Tabitha and I have both been senior regent of the Women of the Moose for the Moscow chapter 710, it changed some minds because we were there and we were fully committed. We did the work for our years. It's unfortunate because international, there were some politics that didn't even involve us. And so some homophobes, or at least people, made it an issue about the drag shows and the gays there. And so international shut it down. It's so funny that this organization that talks about, it's all about the children. They run, basically a boarding school for kids that need it. They're always doing charitable work for kids. And so they took away the 18 and over event for the children, for the young adults who are the most at risk for suicide and self-harm, and just took it away from them because, are you sure you want those events? Are you sure you want that reputation? And God bless the two men who stood up in that meeting and said, well, that we welcome everybody and that we're good people and accepting. Yes, that's the reputation we want. So.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was just fucking ridiculous.
Okay, so yes, you're out in the workplace. You've answered that question. Have you been involved in activism? What goals did you have, and what are the successes and failures, you think?
Oh my goodness. Proposition 1 in Idaho, the anti-gay initiative, 20 years ago, we defeated it. A lot of door knocking, a lot of work. I'm not in Boise, so we really can't do anything with add the 4 words, as far as being there in the legislator's face in Boise. The protesters who were arrested and they needed the money, they had to pay fines, they had court costs. At one of the Tabby Cat shows, we held a march, and everyone could go up and put their donation in the bucket at the front while they were doing the covering their mouths. It was the single largest donation to the fund that they received. And at the time we had a Facebook group with just over 1,000 people in it, and we collected close to that amount at the event. And I looked at the number of members, and I looked at the dollars, and we brought it up to $1 per person who was a member of our Tabby Cat group. And at a later show, I was talking to the audience, and I told them, you don't think your vote counts. You're one person. But if every person in this group votes, if every person donates $1 like we did last time, that's significant. You know, you look at some of the elections in the area. Paulette Jordan lost her first race by a very small margin, and she came back and won by twice that margin in the next cycle. And, you know, she has been a great ally. She has been very outspoken on our behalf. She's attended drag shows. She's spoken at the last 4 or 5 Pride events. That's what we need, and that's what we need to support. And by God, I will continue to give our allies who are running for public office a stage.
Okay, this is where it gets difficult. Can you give me an example of how you've been discriminated against?
You know, there were a few years where, while I was in the restaurant business, I was working for other people, and I had far more restaurant experience than this other gal who was hired at the same time. She was prettier, she was much more feminine, and she got the promotion. The manager didn't like me, you know, and I asked why I had been passed over. Oh, well, I didn't even know you had any restaurant experience. Oh, really? Okay. Okay. You know, it's one of those things where unless you've experienced it and you've seen the side looks and the condescending comments, you know when you're being discriminated against. But if you haven't been discriminated against, you're not going to believe me. And that's why I am far more willing to believe people of color when they share their experiences. Or they just say, I won't go back to that store because I didn't like the way they treated me. They don't have to tell me anything beyond that. I know. We're humans, we give a lot away with our facial expressions.
Definitely. Have you or anyone you know been a victim of a hate crime?
I've already covered that. Will Hendrick is dead. Steve Nelson is dead. Sean Masterton was beaten twice while he was chair of the University of Idaho group. Tabitha had a man at Costco ram her with a shopping cart. I've had people take swings at me. When I ran for city council, I received death threats. I have been shoved into snowbanks and called a dyke. It happens. It has happened to me. It happens less now that I have a mommy voice and some gray hair. But it's still, I'm still very much aware of the potential for violence.
What do you think about the lack of legislative representation in Idaho and what could be changed?
4 words, add them. We're in Idaho. It is ridiculous that I can be terrorized, that I can have people stand outside my door screaming obscenities at me, and I can have them removed, and that they're disturbing the peace or it's something. It's not a hate crime. And the argument against hate crime legislation is that, oh, well, there's always a law that applies. If you're beaten up, you know, that's battery. If they threaten you, that's assault. You don't need the hate crimes legislation. Bullshit. When it's cut and dried and somebody screams, dyke, that needs to be a crime. When somebody walks up to a friend of mine and calls them a sleazy little faggot and shoves them backwards, that is more than just an assault. That's more than just the battery. they are being targeted for who they are or what they are perceived to be. And that is so uncivilized that it should bear a heavier penalty. It should be legislated against. It's also a line in the sand. This is unacceptable behavior. Duh, don't do it.
What's the resistance in Idaho? I mean, because we have color in the legislation.
The resistance is that somehow I will start going after Christians. If a minister refuses to marry me because my partner is female, okay, that's protected. They can do that. They have their freedom of religion. It doesn't need to be extended. Your freedom of religion ends at your nose. I should be able to navigate my life without you standing outside of my store, hitting me, screaming at me, spitting on me, calling me names. There should be an additional burden on those people who cannot be civil to be forced by the law to be civil. I have no desire to ask someone who doesn't want to do business with me to do business with me. I think most people would rather find a supportive baker than penalize one that won't bake the cake. But I'll tell you what, if that baker decides to put my home address out there and encourage their friends to harass me, they need to pay a penalty. And really, that's what that case was about. It's not about protecting good Christians. It's about protecting good citizens from harassment. The fear that we are going to go after these people, that we're going to try to force them to do unnatural things they don't want to, like leave me the hell alone. I don't know what the fear is.
Okay.
I just went off on a tirade, sorry.
No, that's good. What can Idaho do to improve equality?
Idaho could improve the quality. The quality of life in Idaho could be greatly improved by simply adding gay, lesbian, transgender, adding the people most likely to be harassed to the hate crimes legislation, to have people admit that we exist and we are not a threat to them. I think Christians are a bigger threat to gay people than gay people are to Christians, honestly. Just being civil. I mean, former Governor Phil Batt has spoken about his queer grandchildren. We need to look at our behavior. Everyone needs to look in and say, why am I not being civil to these people? What is wrong with me? Why am I not a nice person?
Is there anything else you would like to share or elaborate on or clarify that you've said so far? I always just like to give that opportunity.
I don't know. I think I've rambled enough.
Okay, so now specifically, just from your knowledge, what can you tell me about Stephen Nelson?
Steve always had to be the biggest queer in the room. I've heard so many stories from his coworkers about his generosity and his moral support. There's a trans woman who, just the example of Steve living his life so openly and so beautifully, it helped her. He was genuine. And I think anyone who doesn't understand that, whoever met him, well, you can't help some people who just don't get shit. Steve was a good guy. He was generous. He was a fighter. And it just breaks my heart
what can you say to people who are going to question or blame soliciting sex on websites like Backpage.com? That, you know, like that's the excuse.
You know, the people who are going to look at that as a capital crime are demented. They're the same people that want to outlaw abortion but don't want to care for that child. They're the same people that blame a rape victim. We are all adults. We are all in possession of our own sexuality. If it is two consenting people, it's their business. It is no one else's. You know, and if you want to make soliciting a capital crime, fuck you.
Perfect. I think Steve would agree. Yeah. That's it, Kathy.
Oh, God.